John goes to the baker's shop. Today, John is going to the baker's shop to get some cakes. Do you like cakes? John does. John puts on his bright yellow dungarees with orange sequins on the front, a blue lurex jacket and a white silk scarf.
Lurex, did you say?
John is a fop. Janet says, "Don't forget to pick up some bread for afternoon tea. I'm going to be putting down the new hall carpet, so take your time." See John skip down the road.
I've never skipped.
When John arrives at the bakery, there's no one at the counter. John rings the little bell. Ting-a-ling. Mrs. Parnaby, the baker's wife, comes through the door. Mrs. Parnaby's from Wales. See the funny road signs. "Sorry to keep you waiting, John," says Mrs. Parnaby. "I'm all of a tizzy because our baker is off sick. I have a lot of baking to do this morning. I'm making some rolls for a party at the Labour Club, and I'm not sure they'll be ready." Accent is turning a little towards the Far East. "Can I help you with the baking?" says John. Kind John. Mrs. Parnaby says, "Oh, that'd be brilliant. Pop this apron on and we'll get started." John puts on the apron. See John get out the dough from a big bowl and cut it up into pieces and roll them around on the table. "I see you've done this before. You've nice strong hands," says Mrs. Parnaby. See John blush. When John has made a big batch of rolls, Mrs. Parnaby puts them in the oven. Then John helps Mrs. Parnaby to make some panini. "My husband can't make 'em properly," says Mrs. Parnaby. "They look more like pancakes when he does 'em." Soon the first rolls are ready. Mrs. Parnaby butters one of the rolls, puts a slice of ham into it, and gives it to John to eat. See the butter running down John's beard. John hears the shop door open. It is Mrs. Bone. Mrs. Bone has come to collect the rolls for her party. Mrs. Parnaby is still taking the rolls out of the oven. So John goes out to serve. This is where the story really starts. "Hello, John," says Mrs. Bone. "I didn't know you worked here." "I'm just helping out," said John. "What did you like?" Mrs. Bone says, "I'll have a couple of those bloomer loaves and the baps I ordered yesterday, please." John says, "The baps are nearly ready. If you come through, I'll put them in the box for you. Leave the loaves there, and we'll pick them up on the way back." "Thank you," says Mrs. Bone. "Those panini look very nice." "Yes," says John. "I made them earlier." Soon it is time for John to go home. Mrs. Parnaby gives John 2 big loaves, some crumpets, and some cream cakes to thank him for all his help. "Goodbye, Mrs. Parnaby," says John. "You were gone a long time," says Janet. "Yes," says John. "Mrs. Parnaby at the baker's was telling me she needed a man with strong hands to help her out. I was just having a roll with her in the kitchen when Mrs. Bone came in. I hadn't even time to wash the flour off my hands." Mrs. Bone was admiring my panini under the counter. Mrs. Parnaby said her husband had trouble getting his to rise properly. Then Mrs. Bone saw Mrs. Parnaby's floury baps and asked if she could have some too. So I told her to pop around the back and leave her bloomers on the counter. Do you know how to nail someone's beard to the hall floor? Janet does. Poor John.